We live in an era that praises open-mindedness as an indisputable virtue. From an early age, we're taught that being a good person means accepting differences, listening to opposing views, and living alongside those who think and act in ways completely unlike our own. The culture of respect and inclusion has become almost a moral commandment, and any resistance to it sounds like ignorance or backwardness. But what happens when that openness becomes so wide that it stops protecting the one who practices it? When, in the name of tolerance, we make room for abuse, disorder, and disrespect. Accepting everything makes us vulnerable to everything. And that's where open-mindedness, when taken to the extreme, stops being a strength and begins to slowly eat us from within. It has a seductive glow. It paints the picture of someone evolved, generous, peaceful. No one wants to be seen as closed off or outdated. So we try hard to welcome everything, to consider all possibilities, even when something deeply disturbs us. And that's where the danger lies. There's a point where an open mind becomes a prison, where clarity turns into confusion. It's a subtle point, hidden beneath layers of good intentions, beautiful words, and principles no one dares to question. But it exists, and if we don't see it in time, it starts to silently erode what once felt untouchable. Many live like this today, trying to be tolerant of the intolerable, accepting offenses disguised as opinions, justifying abuse with the language of diversity, enduring what should never be endured, all in the name of a mistaken idea of maturity. The result is a silent exhaustion, a draining of our vital energy every time we swallow the unacceptable just to keep up the image of being kind. And the most dangerous part is that this trap doesn't look like a threat. It appears as empathy, as spiritual growth. It's like poison that tastes like medicine. You keep taking it in small doses, believing you're becoming a better person, when in reality you're exposing yourself to everything you should at least be questioning. To illustrate this, imagine a thought experiment. A group forms with the intention of fighting prejudice, bringing together different people, promoting equality. Everything seems perfect, until the logic of tolerance begins to collapse from within. The welcoming space turns into a battlefield. Virtue turns into weakness. This isn't just a metaphor, it's a mirror. It shows how many relationships, environments, and decisions fall apart when we can't recognize the boundary between acceptance and self-erasure. When we confuse respect with submission, when we give in to avoid conflict, and in doing so, stop protecting ourselves. An open mind is a beautiful path, but it requires discernment. Without it, instead of freeing us, it weakens us. And the worst part, we don't even realize it. We think we're evolving, when in truth we're just losing our essence in the name of a misunderstood virtue. Now, imagine that in the face of growing intolerance, a group is created called anti-discrimination and tolerance. It begins with the best of intentions, to bring people together, promote respect, and encourage dialogue. Everyone is welcome, as long as they respect others. And so, the doors open to individuals of all races, religions, sexualities, social classes, political views, and lifestyles. At first, it's all euphoria. Diversity is celebrated, speeches are emotional, and the feeling of belonging is almost magical. A bubble of hope that seems to have triumphed over the outside world. But like all bubbles, it bursts too soon. Soon, the first tensions arise. Some members, even in the name of tolerance, let prejudices slip through. Comments about others' lifestyles, subtle jabs at religions, ironic remarks disguised as joke. When confronted, they simply say, "We're just expressing our opinion." This is when the group's fragility begins to show. What should be done with those who preach tolerance but act with intolerance? Would expelling them be contradictory? Should intolerance be tolerated for the sake of consistency? Or is it time to break with the ideal of unconditional acceptance and establish clear boundaries? The leadership hesitates. No one wants to seem hypocritical. The fear of appearing inconsistent paralyzes action. The movement, once unified, now faces an uncomfortable choice. Keep the ideal pure and watch it fall apart from within, or accept that even tolerance must have limits. In this tense atmosphere, coexistence begins to deteriorate. Debates grow sharp. Those who still believe in the original purpose start feeling out of place, but they hold on. They believe it's just a phase, that things will soon return to normal. But what these people don't realize, not yet, is that the threat didn't come from outside. The destruction is coming from within, fueled by a contradiction that few have the courage to name, trying to embrace everything, even what sabotages the very act of embracing. Tension peaks when the conflicts stop being isolated incidents and become constant. People who were once enthusiastic begin avoiding the group. The atmosphere, once light, is now filled with heavy silences, suspicious glances, and arguments that border on disrespect. Under pressure, the organizer finally decides to act. They identify the members causing disharmony, confront their behavior, and suggest they step back. After all, they're violating the group's core principle of respect. But this is when the first crisis of coherence arises. One of the accused members raises their voice. "You're excluding us for expressing our beliefs? Isn't that intolerance on your part? Wasn't the group supposed to be about acceptance?" At first glance, the question is disarming. It carries an almost irrefutable logic. The organizer hesitates. He senses something deeply wrong with that reasoning, but knows that if he insists on the expulsion, he'll be accused of betraying his own values. Doubt sets in, and with it, the fear of appearing authoritarian. In an effort to preserve the image of consistency and openness, he backs down. He decides that no one will be expelled. Coexistence, however uncomfortable, must be maintained. After all, everyone has the right to express themselves, even if some expressions cause harm. A sacrifice, in theory, necessary to keep the dream of universal tolerance alive. But this decision opens an invisible wound. Those who feel disrespected realize the space is no longer safe, that their pain matters less than the pride of the intolerant, and so, silently, they begin to withdraw. Some stop participating. Others leave quietly. No one shouts. They simply give up. From the outside, the group looks intact. But inside, it's already begun to die. Because when the most important values are sacrificed in the name of generic inclusion, the space that was meant to welcome becomes hostile to those who need it most. This is the tragedy of the open mind without limits. It tries so hard to include everything that it ends up betraying its own principles. The desire to be fair to all creates injustice for many. The fear of exclusion allows destruction to flourish. And the cruelest part, it all happens with good intentions, which makes it even harder to notice until it's far too late. Over time, the consequences begin to surface. The once inspiring promise of unconditional acceptance becomes the very reason for a quiet unraveling. Meetings that were once lively now drag on in a tense atmosphere. Spontaneous conversations are avoided. Opinions are censored, not by rules, but by the fear of how those who have dominated the space will react. The most sensitive, empathetic, and open-minded, the very people who gave the group its soul, begin to drift away. Not because they've given up on the original idea, but because that idea no longer exists. The space that was meant to protect them has turned hostile. They don't want conflict, so they leave quietly, taking with them the heart of the project. Meanwhile, the intolerant expand their presence. They feel free to impose their criticisms, their views, their contempt dressed up as opinion. They know no one will confront them, because any attempt to set boundaries will be labeled as intolerance. They've learned to turn the group's logic against itself. They've discovered that with the right words, they can say anything. And if questioned, all they need to do is accuse others of being closed-minded, rigid, or hypocritical. This is the perversion of open-mindedness. When everything is permitted, harm wins through sheer exhaustion. Gradually, the group becomes unrecognizable. That original vision of connection and listening turns into a stage for awkward silences, harsh words, and constant insecurity. Those who remain no longer recognize the place, but they don't know how to respond either. They're paralyzed by the ideal of absolute tolerance, and afraid of seeming authoritarian, they fail to do what must be done. The project of unity becomes a painful reflection of its central contradiction. Trying to embrace the entire world is a beautiful idea until the whole world walks in and starts tearing you apart from the inside. And by the time you realize it, what's left is no longer a group, but a battlefield disguised as good intentions. The downfall wasn't sudden. It was slow, gradual, invisible, because it didn't come from the outside, but from a logical mistake that looked like virtue. The mistake of believing that accepting everything is the same as being just. That including everyone, even those who cause harm, is a sign of progress. This part of the thought experiment is not just a warning. It's an accurate portrait of what happens every day in spaces that want to do good but don't know how to draw boundaries. And when those boundaries disappear, the worst instincts take over. What was once light becomes shadow, and everything falls apart without anyone brave enough to say why. The situation reaches its limit. The environment has become unbearable. The meetings are empty. The few who still show up seem to be acting in a play whose script has lost all meaning. It's at this point that the organizer, the one who once dreamed of a fair and harmonious space, finally understands something must change. But now, he doesn't act out of fear of seeming intolerant, nor out of guilt for going against his own message. What moves him now is the real pain of watching the ideal he built crumble from a lack of courage to protect it while there was still time. He no longer wants to please everyone. He wants to save what's left of what was real. In one last effort to save the group, the organizer takes a stand. He gathers the members who caused the most conflict and says, firmly, "You can't stay here. You're not respecting others. You're not open to dialogue. You're sabotaging everything this space stands for." As expected, they respond with the same argument they always use. "So now you're being intolerant of our way of thinking?" But this time, the reply comes without hesitation. "Yes. Because you're not defending ideas. You're hurting people. You're dismantling the very possibility of coexistence. You're breaking the unspoken agreement that makes this space possible." This response marks a turning point. For the first time, someone has the courage to say the obvious, that tolerating those who don't respect others is not a virtue, it's negligence. That accepting everything is not maturity, it's the abandonment of one's own values. Respect only exists when there are boundaries for disrespect. This is the moment when the paradox of tolerance fully reveals itself. The group, created to welcome everyone, must now exclude some to avoid self-destruction. And this exclusion, which once seemed like the end of an ideal, proves to be the only way to preserve what truly matters. Coexistence, freedom, emotional safety. All of it depends on the courage to say no when it's needed. This is one of the hardest lessons to accept, that kindness requires firmness, that gentleness needs discernment, that love for others cannot come at the cost of your own integrity. Because if everything is allowed, even what causes harm, then nothing can be protected. This symbolic moment isn't just a practical decision. It's a moral awakening, a turning point, the realization that for an open mind to remain a virtue, it must learn to close itself off to what destroys. not out of rigidity, but out of protection. Not everything that enters deserves to stay. Not every voice deserves to be heard if it comes with the intent to silence others. This dilemma isn't new. It was named and explored by one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, Karl Popper. In 1945, in the aftermath of World War II, Popper introduced an uncomfortable but essential idea: the paradox of tolerance. According to him, a truly open and just society cannot allow destructive behaviors to spread unchecked. This doesn't mean rejecting differing opinions, but understanding that peaceful coexistence requires at least a basic level of mutual respect. When that respect vanishes, the very space for peace and dialogue dissolves with it. Popper didn't see this as a contradiction, but as an ethical safeguard. He knew that high ideals only survive when they are defended, and sometimes that defense requires drawing clear boundaries. Accepting everything may sound noble, but in practice it opens the gates for destruction to walk in unchallenged. That's not progress. It's fragility in disguise. That's why he proposed a simple but profound principle. Truly free spaces can only remain free if they have the courage to limit attitudes that threaten freedom. Boundaries that don't stem from personal preference, but from a commitment to collective well-being. This teaching, while it may sound harsh, is deeply wise. It reminds us that even our noblest virtues need structure. That constantly giving in is not wisdom, it's vulnerability. And that accepting everything, including what destabilizes, strengthens no one. It only weakens what we hold most dear. Popper's philosophy helps us understand what happened to the group. The collapse didn't come from outside, nor from ill intent. It was the direct result of an ideal taken too far, without discernment. An ideal that forgot to protect itself, and for that reason it fell. This reflection goes beyond theory. It invites us to think more responsibly about the values we uphold, and more importantly, about the boundaries we need to establish. Not to exclude others, but so we don't abandon ourselves. After understanding the paradox of tolerance, an inevitable question arises. How do we define what is unacceptable? Where do we draw the line between what deserves to be embraced and what must be refused? At first glance, it seems simple. We should reject what causes harm. But we quickly realize that this definition is anything but clear. What, after all, is real harm? Something that physically affects us? That causes emotional pain? Can a disturbing idea be considered harmful? And what if it's just an opinion? A lived experience? The line between what challenges us and what wounds us is subtle and deeply subjective. Each person carries their own past, wounds, and sensitivities. What seems like a casual remark to some might touch a deep trauma in others. But at the same time, it's impossible to live in society without occasionally encountering something that unsettles us. This dilemma intensifies when we try to balance two legitimate desires: the desire to express oneself freely and the desire to feel protected from what causes harm. When we prioritize only one of these sides, something breaks. If we defend total freedom of expression, we risk allowing behaviors that cause pain and push away the most vulnerable. But if we prioritize emotional safety above all, we run the risk of silencing important conversations, necessary criticism, and ideas that could burst our protective bubbles. The truth is, there is no single answer. What exists is the ongoing need for reflection and care. It's not enough to focus solely on what is being said. We must also consider the intention, the context, and the real effects on human relationship. We need to listen with empathy, yes, but also with discernment. Accepting the other does not mean accepting everything they say or do. This is where the open mind must also become an attentive mind. Because accepting everything indiscriminately is not a sign of wisdom, it's a sign of passivity. And passivity, when faced with what causes harm, doesn't build bridges. It only allows the ones that already exist to wear down until they collapse over time. This dilemma calls us to take a step toward maturity, to abandon the simplistic view that everything must be accepted or everything must be forbidden, and move toward a more complex space, where every situation demands listening, analysis, and the courage to make difficult decisions. Decisions that won't always please everyone, but that uphold what matters most: true respect between people. In any society that values peaceful coexistence, freedom of expression and emotional safety walk side by side, but almost always in tension. On one hand, the right to speak, to question, to propose new ideas. On the other, the right not to be subjected to things that humiliate, attack, or destabilize. The challenge lies in balancing these principles without letting one destroy the other. If we adopt a stance where any word that causes discomfort must be silenced, we suffocate dialogue. But if we allow all speech to spread unchecked, we ignore the emotional toll that certain words can take on people's lives. It's not about censorship or total freedom. It's about finding a balance where everyone can exist without fear and without oppression. The question that arises is, who defines that boundary? Who has the authority to say what's too offensive or what's simply an uncomfortable opinion? That line is unstable. It shifts with time, with culture, with the experiences of those involved. What was normal yesterday may be unacceptable today. What one person shrugs off, another receives as a deep wound. That's why this conversation demands sensitivity, not fixed rules. Freedom of speech is one of the pillars of democratic societies, but it has never been absolute. It runs up against the dignity of others, and for that reason, it requires responsibility. Having the right to say something doesn't mean everything should be said, nor that every way of saying it is acceptable. Words build, but they also wound. And emotional wounds, no matter how invisible, can last a lifetime. On the other hand, protecting emotions too heavily can make us fragile in the face of reality. Avoiding all discomfort is also avoiding growth. A mind that is too protected risks closing in on itself, living in comfortable, but artificial, bubbles. The answer may not lie in choosing between freedom and protection, but in cultivating a more mature kind of listening. A listening that recognizes another's pain, but also values difference. That understands that living in society often means enduring ideas that upset us, without that ever canceling out mutual respect. At its core, the true challenge of the open mind is this: knowing when to listen, when to respond, when to step back, and when to stand firm. It's not about silencing voices or shielding yourself from everything. It's about finding a form of coexistence that is both honest and considerate, where freedom is not a shield for harm, and protection is not a prison disguised as peace. When it comes to physical harm, the limits are clear. But in the symbolic realm, of ideas, beliefs, emotions, everything becomes blurred. Today, many hostile acts are justified as acts of defense. Groups and individuals take firm, sometimes harsh, stances, claiming they are simply protecting their identity or their emotional safety. But to what extent is what we call defense actually a form of attack? To what extent are we using the feeling of threat to justify disproportionate reactions? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, is what threatens us truly a real danger, or simply the discomfort of encountering something unfamiliar? This ambiguity between attack and defense is one of the great dilemmas of our time. We live in a culture where discourse has become more sensitive and communication more immediate. Every word, gesture, or opinion can be interpreted in countless ways. What to one person sounds like a legitimate opinion, to another may feel like a direct assault on their identity. And this confusion doesn't just happen outside, it happens within us. Sometimes we react aggressively because we feel threatened, insecure, afraid of rejection. Other times we stay silent, believing that speaking up would be aggressive, even when we're just trying to be honest. This tension between defending ourselves and not hurting others, between being true and being kind, follows everyone who wants to live consciously. The problem begins when that tension is no longer examined and becomes automatic, when every uncomfortable idea is instantly labeled as offensive, when every attempt at expression is interpreted as a threat. This excess of caution creates an even more hostile environment where no one feels safe to be sincere, and everything becomes an uncomfortable dance around forced silence. We need to understand that not all pain is caused by malice. Not all disagreement is a personal attack. And at the same time, we must acknowledge that some expressions, even when disguised as opinion, carry destructive intent. The challenge is to distinguish one from the other, and to act with firmness when necessary, but with generosity when possible. What's at stake here isn't just how we communicate, it's the quality of our human relationship. Knowing how to tell the difference between legitimate self-defense and uncontrolled reactivity is a crucial step toward creating truly healthy environments, where people can disagree without causing harm, protect themselves without attacking, and safeguard their well-being without shutting out what can still be understood. In an ideal society, the limits of what's acceptable would be defined by stable institutions, laws, parliaments, courts. In theory, these systems exist to protect coexistence and mediate conflict. But in practice, everything is more fragile. After all, institutions are made up of people, with their own fears, interests, and contradictions. Even when they try to be impartial, their decisions don't always reflect the justice they promise. What is allowed today may be banned tomorrow. What's considered legitimate now might be censored later. And in that back and forth, people live on shaky ground, trying to guess what they can or cannot say, what they should or shouldn't tolerate. It's in this atmosphere of uncertainty that a silent problem is born, the fear of speaking up. Instead of reflecting on what's right, many choose silence just to avoid being judged. The clarity that should come from social norms disappears into a maze of rules that change depending on the group, the context, the dominant ideology. And when institutions fail to offer guidance, each person is forced to create their own criteria, which can be liberating, but also isolating. In this vacuum, conflicts become more intense. Without clear parameters, anything can be seen as attack or defense, truth or manipulation. The absence of common ground makes room for extremes. When everyone uses their own ruler, coexistence becomes unpredictable. There's no longer a shared foundation, only interpretations that shift with the wind. Even if institutions try to regulate, they will never reach what is most intimate, individual discernment. That's why, more than relying on external rules, we need to cultivate a solid internal foundation, a core that allows us to act with integrity even in the face of ambiguity. Because living in society is not just about following laws, it's about developing the wisdom to recognize on your own what preserves shared life and what threatens to dissolve it. This entire collective dilemma is also reflected in our personal lives. Because it's not just society that needs boundaries, you do too. When open-mindedness becomes an absolute value, it's easy to fall into the trap of allowing everything, accepting everything, tolerating everything. But accepting everything in the name of peace can mean permitting abuses that silence your essence. Maybe you've already lived through something like this. That moment when you say, "It's okay," when deep down you know it's not. When you swallow something that hurts just to avoid conflict. When you give too much space to someone who didn't know how to care, and then wonder why you feel so drained. Being too open makes you vulnerable to people who take but never give, to ideas that erode your self-esteem, to a permissiveness that slowly empties you without you even realizing it. Because when you don't define what's acceptable, someone else defines it for you. And that someone often won't treat you with the same care you would have for yourself. Having an open mind doesn't mean dissolving into others. It means knowing where you end and the other begins. It means saying yes with awareness and no with courage. It means understanding that kindness is not submission, that listening is not silencing yourself, that tolerance cannot mean abandoning yourself. Life asks for love, but it also asks for discernment, because if you don't learn how to protect yourself, no one will do it for you. And that open mind, which once seemed like a virtue, can end up being the very door through which everything that disconnects you from who you are comes in. Just like tolerance, other virtues also become dangerous when they lose their balance. Constant positivity, for instance, might seem like a strength, but when it becomes an obligation, it turns into a burden. Smiling all the time, always seeing the bright side, never complaining, always forgiving, all of that can pull you away from your inner truth. Kindness without discernment can prevent you from protecting yourself, from leaving environments that drain you, from speaking your mind with clarity, from putting yourself first when needed. The idea of always being good might be the quickest path to self-erasure. It's not rare to find good people who are exhausted, people who did everything to keep the peace and lost themselves in the process, who accepted what they didn't want, listened to what they didn't deserve, endured what they should have never tolerated, all in the name of an ideal image of goodness that, deep down, only served to sustain imbalanced relationships. Virtues without discernment become traps. They stop being strengths and become weaknesses, not because they are bad in themselves, but because they were lived without wisdom. And wisdom, contrary to what many say, is not about accepting everything. It's about knowing what is worth accepting. Being kind, positive, understanding is essential, but even more essential is knowing when to stop, when to step back, when to say enough. Because no virtue, no matter how beautiful, is worth losing your peace over. Think of a gentle, affectionate dog with no history of aggression. Now imagine that same dog roaming the streets, without an owner, without guidance, without direction. It doesn't become violent out of malice, but out of instinct. Because without direction, instinct takes over. And instinct without consciousness is unpredictable. We are the same when we don't set boundaries for our own values. When we let our virtues run loose, without awareness, without purpose. Open-mindedness, kindness, tolerance, all of them can turn against us if they are not guided by clarity. Because even the best parts of us need direction. They need leadership. They need firmness. A value without a boundary is like a house without a door. Everything comes in, and not everything that comes in is meant to stay. Some things just invade, make a mess, and leave, and you're left with the burden of cleaning it all up. That's why boundaries are not barriers against love. They're the structure that allows love to flourish for real. This isn't about becoming hardened. It's about protecting yourself. It's not about isolation. It's about wisely choosing who or what is allowed in. And when that choice is made with awareness, even the wildest instincts become allies, instead of saboteurs of your peace. In the end, the real issue isn't whether to have an open or closed mind. It's being conscious of what you allow to access your inner world. True freedom doesn't lie in accepting everything, but in knowing how to choose. In saying yes with your heart, and no with a peaceful soul. In embracing what nourishes you, and pushing away what consumes you. You don't need to live in fear of judgment, nor do you need to uphold an ideal of goodness that forces you to ignore your own pain. You only need to remember that even the highest virtues need limit, not because of weakness, but because of wisdom. An open mind is like a door. Not every door needs to be wide open. Some open with gentleness, others close with resolve. Both, in the end, are forms of care, and also forms of love. That's why, at the end of it all, maybe the most important thing is to remember this simple and powerful phrase. Don't keep your mind so open that your brain falls out.